The leaked US regime change manual exposes interference in Ukraine and beyond. Coming up.
Chilling Pentagon plans reveal systematic and violent overthrow of democracies. Why is John Kerry's assistant handing out candies to fanatical rioters bulldozing people and injuring hundreds in unprovoked attacks? And a warning, Washington's quote, jihadists are set on a world war.
When Western colonizers of the 20th century banned parks in Shanghai to dogs and Chinese, they didn't admit to folks back home they were racists, enslaving whole nations and robbing their resources. They reassured the public through mainstream media that they were, quote, civilizing the natives. To trick the savvier 21st century public, scholar Noam Chomsky notes the, quote, pretext has become even more caring. But in practice, the West continuing to overturn governments throughout the world and install puppet regimes. America's current destabilization of Ukraine's government, writes Washington-based analyst Nebojsa Malic, is following the White House regime change manual to the letter. The tip of the icebergs, US senators like McCain flying to Kiev and joining the protesters, while Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland hands them out candies. The reality is top US officials are already calling for sanctions against the country, which would hit exactly the ordinary people they claim to be intervening for. It's accompanied by a hysterical corporate media baying for blood, completely exaggerating protest numbers, ignoring their violence. The US government knows virtual politics has been bankrolling opposition politicians in the Ukraine since the 2004 Orange Revolution, despite admitting the government it's attacking is a democratic one. In fact, writes Rogue State, a guide to the world's only superpower, the US has funded particular parties or candidates in at least dozens of supposedly independent nations and forced out governments in even more. US law, however, strictly forbids any foreign funding of its own politics.
It shall be unlawful for a foreign national to make any contribution of money in connection with political office.
If a foreign power joined Occupy Wall Street protesters and paid the opposition to help bring down the US government, like Washington's doing in Ukraine and elsewhere, analysts say the White House would go ballistic.
There would be a hysteria. That would be regarded as utterly unacceptable interference in the internal affairs of the United States by the government leaders, and yet they have no compunction about doing this now in Ukraine and in many, many other cases around the world. It's clear that what the United States government is after is regime change in the Ukraine, and it has nothing to do with what they say they're concerned about, that is, human rights and democracy. Why are there no sanctions against the United States for what it did to Iraq, or what it's done in Afghanistan, or what it's done in Vietnam, or in so many other countries around the world?
The actors are calling for an emergency meeting. Already expected to attend are Helen Hunt, George Clooney.
The satire Team America notes the growing trend of actors trying to use their glamour to sway public opinion in world politics.
My fellow actors, what the world needs is an international advisory committee who truly understands global politics, namely us.
Angelina Jolie was wheeled into a photo op with disgraced Army Chief Dave Petraeus in Baghdad as people began to question the mainstream version of the Iraq disaster. Never previously showing the slightest interest in Ukraine, in a bizarre case of life-imitating art, George Clooney just jumped on the Kiev bandwagon, reading a Ukraine speech from a script to the side of the camera, apparently written for him by a State Department ghostwriter.
To all of you in the square in Kiev, or all around Ukraine, we here in the United States have great affinity for those seeking democracy.
It's posturing. What does George Clooney know about the economics of Ukraine? Nothing. There's a CIA manual for regime change, and it's being followed to the letter by people on the payroll of Western organizations and governments.
CIA regime change manuals a few decades ago were being airdropped over democratic countries that weren't subservient enough, propaganda booklets like these, under the euphemistic name the Freedom Fighters Manual, were scattered across Nicaragua, instructing citizens how to sabotage their country by cutting telephone lines, leaving taps on, and chopping trees onto highways. The CIA's document publicly admits to terrorism. It carefully avoids the word assassinate in print, calling to, quote, neutralize the country's police, judges, and government officials. Using the language of the mafia world, it writes, professional criminals will be hired to carry out selected, quote, jobs. Far from renouncing these policies, illegal black ops are moving from an auxiliary to the, quote, predominant tactic of US foreign policy, reveals the leaked new army manual from the Pentagon. Meant to be kept secret, the destruction notice reads, destroy by any method that will prevent disclosure. The manual officially orders behaviour it says it's aware is unlawful, including instructing US troops to wear the army uniforms of other countries. It also calls to infiltrate civilian groups and train, quote, guerrilla forces. The document concludes such illegal interference in other countries is now the rule for American policy. US attacks on Iran are, quote, taking a page from the playbook on Ukraine and Georgia. America's training Iranian terrorists, notes the BBC, responsible for thousands of assassinations. But as soon as the Pentagon began funding them, Hillary Clinton took the terrorist group off the official terrorist list. Basic medicines are being blocked by US sanctions on Iran. The Guardian reports this is putting literally millions of lives at risk. Leading war crimes prosecutor Professor Francis Boyle warns Iran's children are going down the path of Iraq. US sanctions since the 90s, there, reports PBS News, are directly responsible for 500,000 deaths of children.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Let's speak to Pepe Escobar at the Asia Times. Great to see you. So state calls 500,000 dead children worth it. In Iran's case, what do they mean by worth it?
The issue of the nuclear program was prefabricated, especially by the US, with an ulterior motive, which everybody also knows what it is: regime change.
Yeah, Barack Obama and David Cameron keep saying the, quote, international community supports them in all this regime changing. Do people really approve of all this?
Look, we have to make a distinction between the US, Canada, the government, not Canadians, and, let's say, 3 European powers, France, Britain, and Germany. And on the other side, this bulk of humanity, let's put it this way, I would say would be like 85% of the world's population, if not more. They know everything about the Iranian dossier because they read in their local press and they follow it in an unbiased way, apart from reading the other Reuters or AP Dispatch.
The Pentagon's new military doctrine simply abandons international principles of sovereignty or the rule of law. A Washington insider told the site Subrealism it seeks nothing less than, quote, world domination, and no independence will be tolerated.
We will defeat adversaries at the time, place, and in the manner of our choosing. Our role in the world depends on projecting our forces in distant environments where adversaries may seek to deny us access.
The Pentagon couches this doctrine in the lovely-sounding phrase, responsibility to protect. Skeptics say it's actually just license to kill. Richard Falk, Princeton professor of international law and the UN Human Rights Rapporteur, it's really great to speak to you. Why does the US always meet so much resistance from people it's supposedly, quote, protecting?
There's a great deal of suspicion around the claims of humanitarian intervention. It actually magnifies the zone of violence and the form of violence. It has the opposite effect of what is intended.
The opposite effect of what was intended in Syria, reports Reuters, may become a watershed for the US. Leaked talks between America and Al-Qaeda last week revealed Washington's no longer insisting on regime change there. Reports America's organ-eating partners saying America's next if they win Syria appears to have got even neocons a little nervous. Author Dr. Gilad Atzmon calls interventionism just murder by another name. Gilad joins us. It's great to speak to you. So if the US stops intervening, what about all the other poor people in the world waiting for the US to bomb and save them?
Interventionism is a recipe to a colossal disaster, and this is something that we see in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We have to let people find their way. If women in Afghanistan want to be liberated, they have to work hard. And I can tell you that when my wife wants something from me, you know, she knows how to do it.
Humanitarian imperialism, using human rights to sell war. A keynote book on the subject writes how Hawke's poster boys for intervention, the Kosovo and Yugoslavia wars, actually prove the opposite, the horrific consequences of US interference. In fact, by its very definition, any US intervention automatically means a country is no longer exercising national sovereignty or the democracy Washington claims to be imposing. The author of Humanitarian Imperialism is Professor Jean Bricmont. Really great to speak to you. Why are you scathing about this policy?
See, democracy presupposes sovereignty. What the US does, in effect, is a world dictatorship. If you take away the sovereignty of the people by constant intervention, by paying the opposition, by buying elections, etc., then it's like a dictatorship.
Yeah, some say every US intervention since Vietnam has failed, and they're hated by the people on the end of them. So why do they keep on interfering?
It's a fanatical religion. I mean, it's our jihad. It's our jihad. I mean, the human rights crowd they are our jihadists.
Humanitarian imperialism lists some signs of the covert regime change campaign. Establishment media screaming, give war a chance. If McCain's posing for pictures with terrorists, the White House is claiming an atrocity's happened the moment it needs an excuse to invade, or celebs are showing a sudden interest in faraway economies, it may be a plan for an interventionist jihad, or more appropriately, a new crusade by the West. Seek truth from facts. This is The Truthseeker.